Hello, so today I'm going to be arguing that we as a nation have come far positively since 1920. I'm going to be offering three main points to support my argument. First, that we have achieved social milestones such as recognizing gay marriage. And second, that we have achieved political milestones such as granting civil rights to African Americans. And thirdly, that we have achieved cultural milestones like granting women employment and education opportunities that were not afforded them before, and also that we have achieved women's right to vote. So, starting on my first point, that we have made great social strides since 1920, especially with the recognition of marriage equality in the United States. According to page 1499 of America Narrative History, in December 2010, Congress repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which since 1993 had resulted in about 9,500 people, specifically gay and lesbian men and women, being discharged from the armed forces. So that was one of the first steps in allowing LGBTQ people to have more equality in the United States. The second step was taken in May of 2012, according to page 1500 of American Narrative History. President Obama came out in support of gay marriage after a decision was made in North Carolina. And his recognition and support of gay marriage was a major step in the insurance of equality for LGBTQ people. In 2013, the Supreme Court overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, or the DOMA, which denied gay and lesbian couples the ability to have federal benefits. That was also page 1500 of American Narrative History. The Supreme Court taking a stance on gay and lesbian issues and the LGBTQ community opened the door for more conversation and more negotiation of what would happen to the LGBTQ community. So once the Supreme Court started to step in, the argument for equal rights for gay and lesbian people became more prominent, which led to the 2013 decision of the U.S. versus Windsor, which was a 5-4 court decision that basically said that you can't withhold spousal benefits from same-sex couples. And that was according to page 1501 of America Narrative History. Further rights being granted to LGBTQ people socially came with the decision in the summer of 2015 of Obergefell versus Hodges. This is found on page 1510 of America Narrative History. It was a 5-4 decision that said that no state could ban same-sex marriages from taking place. So this was a major milestone for the LGBTQ movement, because this essentially said that states couldn't choose whether or not they would allow same-sex marriage to occur, which had been the case before then. Now it was across the country, it's recognized, it's allowed, and it will be performed without question. So I think that was a major social stride and a reason that we've improved since 1920, because an entire group of people that until this point hadn't been recognized had been not only recognized but given the right to get married, to exist, to have rights in the country that they should have already had but didn't up until this point. Again, just like any other movement, which we'll also talk about in the civil rights movement, there's still going to be room for improvement. There's still prejudice against transgender people. There's still prejudice against certain people within the LGBTQ community towards other people in the LGBTQ community. But these issues are minor when it comes to the recognition of the larger part of the whole when it comes to LGBTQ people being given the right to get married and the right to have their benefits recognized federally. That's the first major step, and the little things that come after that are just as important. Moving on to my second point, that we have made political advancements such as affording civil rights to African Americans in the United States. Two campaigns that were heavily used in Birmingham, Alabama, where the largest peaceful protest for civil rights took place, according to page 1330 of America, A Narrative History by David Emery Shee and George Brown Tyndall, were sit-ins and freedom rides. Sit-ins occurred mainly in 1960, and about 3,600 people were arrested between February and July of that year. But Greensboro actually lifted whites-only policies that they had created after these sit-ins took place, so they were very heavily impactful. That's according to page 1324 of America Narrative History. Freedom rides were a test of public transit and public transportation, and it was a test of segregation in those transit systems. So about 18 black and white people in the first Freedom Ride got onto a bus and tested throughout the United States the public transit systems and segregation that occurred on them. After a few freedom rides that were not peaceful towards those protesters and a lot of violence being experienced on their end, the Interstate Commerce Commission in September of 1961 ordered that the public transit systems be integrated. This is according to page 1328 of America, A Narrative History. As I had stated, these two campaigns were used heavily in Birmingham, Alabama, where Governor George Wallace proclaimed segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That's according to page 1330 of American Narrative History. After thousands of arrests, numerous assaults on protesters, and threats against Dr. King and the people who were working alongside him in the protests, President Kennedy introduced a civil rights bill in June of 1963. Now, that wasn't passed until June of 1964, so not until a year later was it actually passed. And then it was made law in July of 1964, July 2nd, 1964, according to page 1334 of American Narrative History. So at that point, it was declared that equal treatment under the law for all Americans would be the standard in the United States. And that's according to page 1341 of American Narrative History. And that's not to say that there isn't still work that needs to be done. Individuals like Malcolm X and individuals like Bobby Seale from the PBS primary document that we received, those individuals played very large roles in encouraging civil rights to continue to develop after the law was passed. Because just because a law is passed doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist, doesn't mean that we still have social issues we need to address, like our criminal justice system. So individuals like Malcolm X and Bobby Seale from the Black Panthers are still major influences of improvements upon civil rights, which we do still have a lot of issues with. We do still have issues with racism in our criminal justice system, racism just being so heavily ingrained in our society, especially seen with police officers and unarmed Black individuals who've been killed. There's still a lot that needs to be built upon in our country in terms of equal treatment of African Americans in our society. However, we did take a very large step in ensuring that civil rights were granted to African Americans. And I think though there's still progress to be made, we have come a very long way, and passing civil rights alone is a reason why we have improved since 1920 as a nation. Moving on to my third and final point, that culturally we have come far positively since 1920 due to the increased liberation of women and the expansion of their rights and opportunities in the United States. According to George Tyndall's An Epoch of Confusion, the 1920s lecture, around minute 318, he states that it was the era of the flapper, the era of the liberated woman. The women were granted the right to vote in the 1920s, and this kind of created a ball rolling that would grant them more employment opportunities, more freedom in general to have education that they wouldn't have been able to have had before. Women had role models to look up to, like aviator Amelia Earhart, who took the first solo trip around the Atlantic by plane in 1932, according to page 1037 of America and Narrative History. According to page 1041 of America and Narrative History, a woman named Margaret Sanger in 1912 began to distribute birth control information to women. In 1921, she created the American Birth Control League, which eventually would be called Planned Parenthood. This started the movement for women to be in charge of their own reproductive rights and in charge of their own bodies, which was a major step. In America Narrative History, Tyndall and She, on page 1045, begin to describe the new women. So these women are referred to as flappers, and they wanted more out of life than marriage and motherhood and what their mothers had considered socially acceptable. So after they gained the right to vote, they became more rebellious. They began wearing more liberating clothing that wasn't as constraining and covering. And they began to ask for more of society and for more of life around them. They began to ask for employment opportunities, for education, for the ability to do what they want without having to answer to men and to society. So this began a large stride in positive cultural change since 1920 that I believe is a firm point that we've come far positively as a society since then. Though there was a start to the opportunities for employment for women as clerks and salespeople, the actual movement for jobs for women really did start in World War II. Tyndall and She, in page 1206 of America and Narrative History, mention how World War II opened the door for women to have more meaningful jobs and more purpose granted to them outside of the home. Though once the war was over and the men came back, their role kind of reassumed to homemaker. However, allowing them to participate in assembly line jobs and jobs where they were handling equipment was a major stride culturally for women. In the 1960s, a woman named Betty Friedman, according to page 1376 of America Narrative History, began the movement of the feminine mystique and the new feminist movement. So she was also the first president of the National Organization for Women, or the NOW organization, which called for a change to the way women in America were experiencing equality and opportunity. So this started the talk about Title IX and gender equality and discrimination in the workplace. And so this led to the early 70s when women and their role in the workplace and their role as equal and respected members of working society began to be recognized. This also led to the 1973 Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case, which decided that women have a fundamental right to choose whether or not they want to bear a child. This was a huge stride socially for women to be able to have control of their bodies and control of what they want to do with themselves in terms of if they want to be a homemaker, if they want to be a career woman. This truly gave them the full right to be able to choose their direction as an individual. So from 1920 to now, we've come extremely far positively for women. There still isn't complete equality in the workplace. There still isn't complete equality in terms of women's pay versus men's pay. However, the fundamental decisions, like women being able to choose the right to their own body, women being able to decide if they want to be a homemaker, if they want to hold a real job, if they want to have a college education, those major steps have been taken, and there are still some fine-tuning aspects that need to be addressed. However, as a whole, women have come very far. And so, socially, compared to other countries like Afghanistan or Iran, even, women have an immense amount of liberation and opportunity for choice and determination of their own lives than they do in other countries, but especially in our own country since 1920. The information regarding Roe versus Wade is found on page 1377 of America, a Narrative History. So overall, we can see socially, with the passage and acceptance of gay marriage in the United States, politically with the granting of civil rights to African American people, and culturally with the advancements in women's rights and a woman's right to choose, we have positively come very far since 1920. In each of those fields, there are still small things that need to be improved upon and further advancements that can be made. But as a whole, we've taken major steps, whether it be recognizing marriage equality, whether it be granting civil rights and that being enacted, or whether it be a Roe versus Wade decision and the advancement of women in the workplace. There are major aspects of each of those social, political, and cultural fields that have been achieved. And there are always going to be little improvements that we can make, but as a whole, we have come very far since 1920. And I believe that the evidence that I showed in the video today will help you come to that conclusion as well. If you have any questions or concerns, or comments, please let me know, and I'd be happy to answer any of them. If I need to do some, further investigation, I definitely will. But hopefully, this video as a whole gave you the conclusion that I did, that we've come very far, even if there are still things we need to improve upon.